Hi, this is Dr. Karen Hall again, and I'm going to talk to you now about the process of having your photograph taken and thinking about what this experience was like for people in the 19th century. How did they get their photos taken? What was it like to go and visit a photographer? Why did people do this? And who were those photographers? To start off with, I think it's useful to think about who is taking the photos and how do they know how to do this. The origins of photography are diverse and at times contested, with many different inventors of many different processes and sometimes certainly different perspectives on who did the inventing. But what they show is that the origins of photography are firmly in the amateur realm. These discoveries were carried out by people who were enthusiasts, experimenters, scientists, and from there gave rise to the profession of photography. So who took early photographs? What we can see from the contested beginnings of photography is that there were lots of people working in this area, and most of them came from amateur backgrounds, or at least from different areas. They were enthusiasts, they were experimenters, they were scientists trying out new ideas. And what this meant was that a lot of the innovations in photography were not made by people who would have called themselves photographers as such, but whose work resulted in something that could become a profession. And so through the mid-19th century, we see both the professionalisation of photography as people train up in these new techniques and find a market for it, but also that there's still amateur photography going on. Though I have to say that a lot of this amateur activity was conditioned by class and resources. Prominent amateur photographers like Julia Margaret Cameron had considerable wealth that enabled them to carry out their amateur work. In terms of the spread of photography to Australia, we see how this professionalisation starts to enable this new form of image making to come to the colony. Many early photographers trained in places that they didn't come from, and this is how photography spread through the world quite rapidly as people from America went to Europe to train, that took ideas back, and similarly that trained professionals circulated to the colonies. Information also circulated, and if we look at an entry in the Australian in 1842, we see both a description of the photographic process, which culls information from a range of international newspapers describing photography's initial invention, what this process of making images from light can do. But it also advertises the possibility of having your own photograph taken. So in this entry in the Australian, it invites the inhabitants of Sydney to come and see this extraordinary process, which will be open to the public at the Royal Hotel, and where the photographic apparatus will be on display, but also where one can have one's photograph taken to enter into this new genre of the photographic portrait. So what's interesting here is that it's obviously a temporary space. A hotel is not where you think of to go and get your photo taken. But from these beginnings, photographers rapidly realised that they needed to set up dedicated studio spaces where they could house their equipment, but also where customers could come and find them. And this gives us some clues when we're trying to date historic photographs. These photographers, or their business names as a studio, are often stamped on the photograph itself or on the mount, recorded, and this can help you to date and place your photographs, particularly if the photographer or the studio moved often or was only open for a short period of time. The best way to find out those kind of details is to look up biographies of photographers or to go to trade directories and journals, which can even nail down your photographer to a particular location. The success of these photographic studios can again be seen in the kind of advertisements that they're putting out. So in the Avoca Mail in 1863, we have an advertisement for Solomon and Bardwell, who cite themselves as photographic artists and invite the public to come to get a carte de visite, which they can offer varying prices for, depending on how many copies you would like. But what's interesting as well about this image is they identify themselves as being initially from Ballarat. And what they're doing here is setting up a new studio in Avoca, where again they'll have a permanent premise that people can come visit. Photographers and studios also moved around. Some photographers would travel through regional areas, setting up temporary studios in outdoor locations or in other buildings, and again would advertise their presence there to a general public. So again, if you're trying to place or date a photograph, another really good resource can be Trove, which allows you to have access to those newspaper advertisements. But say you've seen an advertisement, you decide you need to have your photograph taken. What's the experience actually like of being in the studio? Well, one of the things that this experience initially is a big event. Photographic processes allowed people who would not normally have contemplated having a painted portrait made of themselves, who could not afford it or not seen it as appropriate, to now access this mode of recording themselves. But this whole genre of portraiture tends to lend itself to big events, commemorations, important milestones in one's life, as well as having a social function of being able to share this idea of who you are. So people would dress up to go to the photographic studios. They would be wearing their best clothes. And again, this can be another tool for dating. If you look at what they're wearing and look at how that matches with fashions, it can help you to find that time. There are some provisos though. Best clothes aren't always the most recent clothes, and particularly for elderly people, their vision of their favourite best outfit may be somewhat out of date. So using fashion to date photographs always comes with a little bit of a warning. Nonetheless, going into the studio, standing there and having your photograph taken also enabled you to present a particular vision of yourself. In some photographs, this version of oneself seems a little bit stilted, and that's because particularly with the early photographic processes, you did need to keep still for quite some time. And this is where you might even notice in photographs of children that they've got their head held in mounts or in other kind of supporting devices to keep them still. Nonetheless, one of the advantages of having one's photograph taken in the studio, where photographers could use wet plate collodion methods or have their equipment on hand, was that it was often shorter exposure times than it might be outside. Though in some cases the bright natural light outside could also shorten the process. As photographic techniques progressed, this period of having to stay still becomes shorter and poses become more informal. So that can also give you a very general sense of where an image might be taken. So you stand there and you look at the camera, and the camera looks back and records you. But when we look at these photographs, we notice that it's not only the people in them, but also what is on either side, what Kate Flint and other writers about Victorian photography call the surround. And in studios, this is a really highly controlled environment, a set of props that are available. And particular photographers obviously had their own props that would get used and reused. So even if you can't see a name of a photographic studio, you may, through a process of comparison, if you know the area, be able to work out which photographer took the image simply by going, oh my goodness, I recognise that piece of furniture. These kinds of props, again, shift over time as fashions change. So they start off in early photography as being very plain backdrops and kind of basic, and becoming more elaborate as the century progresses, till by the 1800s you have elaborate painted backgrounds, props that allow you to set up an elaborate rural scene, or furniture that looks highly fashionable, pot plants, Roman columns for a classical look, a whole array of items that can also be used again to present yourself not just as what you look like, but some kind of version of what you aspire to be. The props can also be more individualised, and they can tell us something about the people in the photographs. For example, a brewer might be photographed holding bottles, not because he's an alcoholic necessarily, but simply because those are the marks of his trade. So we can see in studio photography, there's a sense in which people are negotiating a process that's been set down for them, where the photographer has certain expectations about what they need to do that are conditioned by the technologies available and the environment they're working in. But there's also scope for individuality, for people to choose what they wear, to have some control over how they're posed, to present a vision to the world that gives a particular version of themselves, the self that they want you to see. And so as viewers of photographs, the kind of interpretation we can make is not just to identify who is in the photograph and where and when it was taken, but to think about the choices that the individual in the photograph has made to give us a sense of who they really are.